I arranged Christmas dinner with trembling hands. A modest meal, roasted chicken, cheap wine, baked potatoes. 2 extra place settings for my son and his wife. Then came the message, "Sorry, Dad, something came up." Minutes later, I saw their photos on social media, celebrating at her parents' luxurious dinner instead. Red dress, champagne, everything I couldn't provide. That abandoned Christmas dinner was just the beginning of discovering how my own family had been lying to me for months. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe. This story gets much more intense. The kitchen felt smaller than usual as I moved around it, checking the small roasted chicken in the oven for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. The golden skin was already perfect, but I needed something to do with my hands, something to keep the nervous energy at bay. I'd been planning this dinner for weeks, carefully budgeting for the wine, the decent cut of meat, even splurging on those fancy dinner rolls from the bakery downtown. This was going to be the first Christmas dinner I'd hosted since Martha passed, and I wanted everything to be perfect for my son David and his wife Jennifer. The dining room table looked almost festive with my best tablecloth, the cream-colored one with tiny holly patterns that Martha had insisted on using every December. I'd set 3 places with our wedding china, the pieces that had survived decades of holiday meals and family gatherings. The wine glasses caught the warm light from the overhead fixture, casting small rainbows on the white fabric. I'd even managed to find matching cloth napkins in the linen closet, though they smelled a bit musty from being stored too long. The centerpiece was simple but meaningful, a small arrangement of pine branches I'd cut from the tree in the backyard, the same tree David used to climb as a boy. Everything was ready. Everything was waiting, and I felt a cautious optimism bubbling in my chest as I glanced at the clock, showing 5:30. My phone buzzed against the kitchen counter, and I hurried over, expecting to see a message saying they were running a few minutes late. David was always punctual, a trait he'd inherited from his mother, so I wasn't worried when I saw his name on the screen. But as I read the words, my stomach dropped like a stone thrown into deep water. "Sorry, Dad, something came up. Can't make it tonight? Rain check?" I stared at the message for a long moment, reading it over and over, hoping the words would somehow rearrange themselves into something that made sense. The chicken timer chose that moment to go off, filling the silent house with its shrill beeping, and I realized I was still holding my breath. I turned off the oven and pulled out the perfectly roasted bird, its skin crackling with rendered fat and herbs. Steam rose from the golden surface, carrying the rich aroma that had filled the house all afternoon, a smell that should have brought comfort, but now felt like mockery. The wine sat unopened on the counter, the label promising celebration and warmth that would never come. The rational part of my mind tried to make excuses. Maybe there really was an emergency. Maybe Jennifer had fallen ill. Maybe David's work had called with some crisis. But deep down, in the part of my heart that had been growing colder since Martha died, I suspected this was something else entirely. Unable to resist the pull of social media that had become my window into my son's life, I picked up my phone again and opened the app I rarely used but couldn't seem to delete. David's profile showed recent activity, posted just 20 minutes ago, and I felt my chest tighten as the images loaded. There he was, not dealing with an emergency or tending to a sick wife, but standing in what was clearly Jennifer's parents' dining room. The mahogany table gleamed under crystal chandeliers, laden with an elaborate spread that made my humble chicken look pathetic in comparison. Jennifer wore a stunning red dress that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a month, her smile radiant as she raised a glass of champagne toward the camera. David stood beside her in a charcoal suit I'd never seen before, his arm around her waist, looking relaxed and happy, in a way I hadn't seen him look in my presence for years. The contrast between their elegant celebration and my simple, abandoned dinner felt like a physical blow, stealing the breath from my lungs and leaving me gripping the counter for support. I scrolled through more photos, each one a fresh wound. Jennifer's father carving a massive prime rib. Her mother presenting a dessert tower that belonged in a magazine, the whole family toasting with glasses full of what looked like expensive champagne. The timestamps showed they'd been there for hours. This wasn't a last-minute emergency. This was a choice. 3 days after the abandoned Christmas dinner, David appeared at my door wearing a crisp white shirt that looked new, and I felt a surge of relief at seeing him again. The fabric had a subtle sheen to it, the kind of quality I rarely saw in my own clothes, and there was even a small tag still attached to the sleeve that he hadn't noticed. His hair was neatly styled, and he looked healthy and successful in a way that made my heart swell with pride. Everything about his appearance suggested that life was treating him well, that perhaps the struggles of his 20s were finally behind him. I'd always worried about David's career path, the way he'd jumped from job to job without seeming to find his place in the world. But standing there in my doorway, he looked like a young man who'd finally found his footing. The contrast with my own worn cardigan and house slippers was stark, but it filled me with satisfaction rather than embarrassment. This was what I'd worked for all those years, to give my son opportunities I'd never had. "Dad, I'm sorry about Christmas," he said, as I welcomed him inside, and his voice carried genuine remorse that eased some of the hurt I'd been carrying since that lonely dinner. He settled into Martha's old armchair, the one with the faded roses that she'd refused to reupholster because it held too many memories, and for a moment it felt like old times when he used to visit regularly. His apology seemed sincere, and he explained that something urgent had come up with work, the kind of last-minute crisis that I remembered from my own career, those situations where personal plans had to be sacrificed for professional obligations. I found myself nodding with understanding, remembering all the times I'd disappointed Martha with canceled dates and missed family events because of work emergencies. Perhaps I'd been too quick to judge, too ready to assume the worst, when there might have been perfectly reasonable explanations for his absence. The photos on social media could have been from another day entirely, or maybe they'd stopped by Jennifer's parents briefly before dealing with whatever crisis had arisen. As I made tea using Martha's best china, the cups with the delicate blue flowers that we'd saved for special occasions, David began telling me about an exciting opportunity that had come his way. His eyes lit up as he described a startup project, some kind of technology venture that he spoke about with the enthusiasm I hadn't heard from him in years. The details were complex, involving partnerships and investments and business concepts that went over my head, but his passion was infectious. He gestured with his hands as he talked, the way he used to when he was a child, telling me about his dreams and ambitions, and I found myself leaning forward to catch every word. This sounded different from his previous ventures, more substantial somehow, and I began to feel that familiar flutter of hope that maybe this time he'd found something that would give him the stability and success he'd been searching for. The shirt, the confidence in his voice, the way he carried himself, all of it suggested that good things were happening in his life. "I just need some initial capital to get things started," he said, his tone becoming more serious, more businesslike, and I realized this wasn't just a social visit to apologize for Christmas. The request didn't surprise me. David had always been ambitious, and I knew that good opportunities often required upfront investment. He explained that he needed to show potential partners that he was serious about the venture, that a modest contribution from family would demonstrate his commitment and help leverage larger investments from professional backers. The way he presented it made perfect sense, and I felt a surge of pride that he'd come to me, that despite everything, he still saw his old father as someone who could help him achieve his dreams. Martha had always said that our job as parents was to give our children wings, to help them fly when they were ready, and this felt like one of those moments when parental support could make all the difference in a young person's future. I excused myself and went to the bedroom where I kept my emergency savings, the money I'd been setting aside from my pension for situations exactly like this one. The bills were tucked away in an old shoebox beneath Martha's sweaters, carefully organized and counted, representing months of careful budgeting and small sacrifices. As I counted out what I could spare, I felt the familiar mixture of anxiety and satisfaction that came with helping my son, anxiety about my own financial security, but satisfaction at being able to provide for him when he needed it most. This was what parents did, what my own father had done for me when I'd needed help getting started in life. And the tradition felt both weighty and right. When I returned to the living room with the envelope, David's face broke into the kind of smile I hadn't seen since he was a teenager, genuine and unguarded and full of gratitude that made my chest tight with emotion. "Don't let Jennifer worry about finances," I said, as I pressed the money into his hands, surprised by how rough my own voice sounded. "I can still take care of you both when you need it." The hug he gave me felt warm and solid, and for those few seconds, I was just a father being thanked by his son, the way it had always been between us. He promised to keep me updated on the project's progress, to let me know how the investment was working out, and I found myself already imagining the success story he'd tell me in a few months' time. After he left, driving away in a car that looked newer than I remembered, I sat in Martha's chair and finished my tea, feeling useful and needed in a way I hadn't experienced since her death. The house felt less empty somehow, filled with the possibility that I'd just played a small part in securing my son's future. And that night I slept better than I had in weeks. Have you ever helped a family member financially? How do you balance supporting loved ones with protecting your own security? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. 2 weeks passed before I saw those photos on social media, and they stopped me cold as I scrolled through my phone during a quiet Sunday morning. Jennifer's family had posted pictures from what looked like a luxury resort, crystal blue waters, white sand beaches, champagne glasses catching tropical sunlight. The location tag read Maldives, and I stared at the images with growing confusion. Her parents looked relaxed and tanned, raising expensive drinks toward the camera, while Jennifer herself appeared in several shots wearing different designer swimwear and flowing dresses that probably cost more than my monthly pension. The timestamps showed they'd been there for days, posting updates about spa treatments and private dinners and sunset yacht excursions. I scrolled through image after image, trying to reconcile this lavish vacation with David's urgent need for startup capital, wondering if somehow these two realities could coexist in ways I didn't understand. Maybe Jennifer's parents had paid for the trip, I told myself. Maybe this was unrelated to the money I'd given David. Maybe I was connecting dots that didn't belong together. But doubt had planted itself in my mind like a seed, and over the following days it grew into something I couldn't ignore. I found myself thinking about David's expensive clothes, his new car, the casual way he'd accepted my money without even counting it. The more I thought about it, the more questions arose, until I couldn't concentrate on anything else. Finally, I decided to visit his apartment directly, not to confront him, but to put my worries to rest, to see for myself that my money was being used responsibly. I told myself I'd just drop by with the remainder of what I'd set aside for him, maybe stay for coffee, maybe get a clearer picture of how his business venture was progressing. The glass jar of coins I'd been saving rattled in my coat pocket as I walked up the stairs to his building, each step feeling heavier than the last. The door to his apartment stood slightly ajar when I reached the landing, and I paused with my hand raised to knock, hearing voices from inside that made me freeze in place. Jennifer's tone was sharp, impatient, cutting through the afternoon silence like a blade. "Your dad gave too little. It's not enough for our Japan trip. You need to ask him for more." The words hit me like a physical blow, each syllable confirming the fears I'd been trying to suppress. I pressed my back against the hallway wall, my heart hammering so loudly I was certain they'd hear it, holding my breath as I waited for David's response. When it came, his voice was quieter, almost apologetic. "All right. I'll try to ask him again." Not a defense of his father's generosity, not a refusal to manipulate an elderly man's love, just casual agreement to extract more money from someone who was already struggling to make ends meet. I stood there in the dim hallway, my fist clenched so tightly that my nails dug crescents into my palm, trying desperately to find some innocent explanation for what I'd just heard. Maybe he was just humoring her, I told myself. Maybe he'd refuse later, in private. Maybe this was just marriage politics, the kind of compromise couples make to keep peace. But even as I constructed these excuses, I knew they were lies I was telling myself to avoid facing the truth that was crystallizing in my chest like ice. The sound of footsteps inside made me quickly step back toward the stairway, arranging my face into what I hoped looked like the expression of a father arriving for a pleasant visit, rather than a man who'd just discovered his worst fears were justified. When David opened the door and saw me standing there, his face lit up with what I now recognized as calculated pleasure rather than genuine happiness. "Dad, perfect timing," he said, his eyes immediately focusing on the envelope in my hands, with the practiced attention of someone who'd learned to spot opportunity. He reached for it without hesitation, without asking what it was for or whether I could afford to give it, and I watched in stunned silence as he tore it open and pulled out the bills I'd scraped together. He didn't count them, didn't thank me beyond a perfunctory nod. Instead, he turned and walked straight to Jennifer, who was sitting on their pristine white leather sofa, and handed her the entire amount. She tucked it into her designer purse, a glossy black thing that probably cost more than my car payment, with the casual efficiency of someone depositing funds into a personal account. I forced myself to smile and make small talk for a few more minutes, but my eyes kept wandering around their apartment, taking in details I'd somehow missed during previous visits. The crystal chandelier hanging over their dining table, the imported bottles of liquor arranged on a glass bar cart, the artwork on the walls that looked expensive and professionally framed. Everything spoke of a lifestyle I'd never even dreamed of achieving, funded by God knew what sources, and now, apparently, by my pension checks. As I prepared to leave, offering weak excuses about errands to run, I caught sight of my reflection in their hallway mirror and barely recognized the old man staring back at me. He looked defeated, hollowed out, clutching a glass jar of coins like some pathetic character from a Dickens novel. Walking down the stairs toward the exit, I could hear their voices resuming inside the apartment, probably planning their next vacation or shopping spree, and the sound made the coins in my jar rattle with each step I took. For the first time since I'd started helping David financially, those carefully saved quarters and dimes felt not generous, but ridiculous. The desperate scrapings of a fool who'd been played by people young enough and smart enough to know exactly which buttons to push. The afternoon sun felt harsh on my face as I emerged from the building, and I realized that something fundamental had shifted inside me during those few minutes in the hallway. The loving father who'd climbed those stairs was gone, replaced by someone who finally understood the difference between supporting a child's dreams and enabling their greed. Have you ever overheard something that completely changed how you saw a family member? How did you handle the betrayal of someone you trusted completely? The glass jar of coins felt heavier in my coat pocket as I walked through Murphy's Discount Market the next morning, my mind still replaying the scene from David's apartment like a broken record. I moved through the familiar aisles mechanically, checking expiration dates on marked-down bread, comparing prices on dented cans of soup, my usual routine of stretching every dollar, feeling more pathetic than ever after what I'd witnessed. Rose, the kind cashier who always saved the best discounted items for regular customers like me, smiled and pointed to a package of chicken thighs she'd set aside. But even her thoughtfulness couldn't lift the weight that had settled in my chest. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as I loaded my modest purchases into the old sedan, each item a reminder of how carefully I had to budget while my son and his wife lived in luxury, funded by my sacrifices. The morning sun felt weak and distant as I started the engine, and I found myself driving slower than usual, as if reluctant to return to the empty house where I'd have nothing to do but think about what I'd discovered. The traffic light at 5th and Main caught me just as I was debating whether to stop for coffee I couldn't really afford, and I sat drumming my fingers on the steering wheel while waiting for the signal to change. That's when I saw them again, emerging from Bellecourt Boutique like actors stepping onto a stage, and my heart dropped into my stomach as the full scope of their deception became clear. David wore a charcoal overcoat that looked like it had been tailored specifically for him, the fabric so rich and smooth it seemed to absorb light, while Jennifer walked beside him in a cream-colored ensemble that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in 3 months. They each carried multiple shopping bags, not the plain paper sacks I was used to seeing, but glossy affairs with ribbon handles and embossed logos that caught the sunlight like jewelry. Everything about them screamed money, screamed success, screamed the kind of lifestyle that should have taken years to build through honest work, rather than weeks, to acquire through manipulation of an elderly father's love. I slid lower in my seat, suddenly ashamed of my discount groceries and 15-year-old car, watching them move with the casual confidence of people who'd never had to check price tags or count change. David gestured toward a sleek black sedan parked at the curb, not the modest vehicle I remembered him driving, but something that belonged in luxury car advertisements, and handed a set of keys to a young man in a red vest. Then I saw it, the detail that made everything crystal clear and sent ice water through my veins. David pulled out his wallet and extracted a credit card, holding it casually as he spoke to the valet. And even from across the street, I could see the distinctive black surface that I recognized because I'd signed the application myself. It was the emergency credit card I'd given him months ago, the one I'd stressed was only for true emergencies, the one that was directly linked to my checking account and would show up on my monthly statements. My chest felt like someone had reached inside and squeezed my heart with a cold fist. The traffic light turned green, but I couldn't move, couldn't do anything but stare as David laughed at something Jennifer said as they climbed into their expensive car with their expensive purchases bought with my money. Cars behind me began honking, but the sound felt distant and unimportant compared to the roaring in my ears, the crushing realization that everything I'd believed about my son was a carefully constructed lie. This wasn't a struggling young couple trying to build a future together. This wasn't a son who occasionally needed help from his father. This was systematic exploitation, a calculated effort to drain every penny from an old man who'd been stupid enough to confuse love with enabling, generous enough to let his parental instincts override his common sense. The honking grew louder and more insistent, forcing me to press the gas pedal with a trembling foot, and I drove home in a haze of betrayal so complete it felt like physical illness. My hands shook so violently that the coins in my pocket rattled like dice in a cup, the sound mocking me with each turn of the wheel, each reminder of how carefully I'd been saving those quarters and dimes, while David spent my credit card balance on luxury shopping sprees. By the time I parked in my driveway, the trembling had spread through my entire body, and I had to sit for several minutes before trusting myself to walk into the house without collapsing. Inside, I set my discount groceries on the kitchen counter without unpacking them, staring at the modest collection of marked-down items that suddenly felt like evidence of my own stupidity, proof that I'd been living like a pauper so my son could live like a prince. That night, sleep became impossible, so I found myself sitting at Martha's old desk in the study, while the house settled around me in the darkness. The yellowing lampshade cast familiar shadows across the worn wood surface as I spread my bills in front of me like cards in a losing hand. Electricity, gas, car insurance, property taxes, medical expenses, all the mundane costs of living that I'd been cutting back on to fund David's lifestyle. I pulled out the small notebook where I'd been tracking my contributions, each entry written in my careful handwriting with dates and amounts and notes about his supposed business ventures. David, $500. Startup capital, May 15th. David, $300. Additional investment, June 3rd. David, emergency credit card, July 10th. Page after page of my faith in him, documented in neat columns that now read like a record of systematic theft disguised as parental love. Each entry had been made with such hope, such pride in being able to help my son achieve his dreams, and now I understood that the only dreams I'd been funding were shopping sprees and vacation plans and luxury purchases that had nothing to do with business success or personal growth. I leaned back in Martha's chair and closed my eyes, seeing her so clearly in my memory as she stood in our small kitchen 25 years ago, placing homemade candles on a birthday cake for 8-year-old David, her face glowing with the kind of unconditional love that asks for nothing in return. She'd given everything to that boy, her time, her dreams, her health, believing she was raising someone who would honor the sacrifices she'd made. The thought that she would never know how thoroughly we'd failed, how completely our love had been twisted into a weapon against our own well-being, felt like both mercy and tragedy rolled into one unbearable truth. My hand found the pen on the desk and gripped it until my knuckles went white against the plastic barrel, and for the first time since this nightmare began, a thought crystallized in my mind with the clarity of winter air. If I continued down this path, continued enabling David's deception and funding his greed, I wouldn't just lose my money. I'd lose whatever dignity and self-respect I had left, whatever remained of the man Martha had married and believed in. I closed the notebook with a sharp snap and locked it in the desk drawer, the click of the mechanism sounding final in the quiet room. No more money. No more credit cards. No more believing in business ventures that existed only in my imagination. But even as I made this resolution, I knew that simply cutting off the flow of funds wouldn't be enough to address what had been done to me. David and Jennifer, and her whole family, judging by those vacation photos, had spent months treating me like nothing more than a convenient ATM, manipulating my love and exploiting my trust with the casual cruelty of people who saw elderly parents as resources to be mined rather than human beings deserving of respect. They'd lied to my face, stolen from my accounts, turned my parental devotion into a source of funding for their luxury lifestyle, while I scraped together coins and cut back on necessities. If I didn't find some way to make them understand the consequences of their actions, didn't teach them that their behavior had real costs for real people, they'd simply find new ways to extract what remained of my limited resources. The mirror on the wall reflected my face in the dim lamplight, gaunt, tired, marked by months of financial stress and emotional manipulation. But my eyes held something that hadn't been there before, something that looked like resolve hardening into purpose. I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street where I'd lived for 30 years, where Martha and I had raised our son and built what we thought was a good life filled with love and trust and mutual respect. Those days felt like ancient history now, buried beneath layers of deception and greed that had transformed my child into a stranger, my generosity into a weakness to be exploited. But as I stood there in the darkness, feeling the weight of betrayal settle into my bones like winter cold, I realized that something fundamental had changed inside me during these past few weeks. The pleading, hopeful father who'd written all those entries in his notebook was gone, replaced by someone who finally understood that some lessons could only be taught through consequences, that protecting people from those consequences wasn't love. It was enabling. Tomorrow, I decided, I would begin teaching my son a lesson he'd never forget. One that would make him understand exactly what it cost to betray the people who loved him most. I sat at Martha's desk the following morning, staring at a blank envelope that seemed to hold more weight than any letter I'd ever written, and for the first time in weeks, my hands were perfectly steady. The paper felt crisp between my fingers as I picked up the same blue ballpoint pen I'd used to document all those hopeful contributions to David's supposed future. But today, the weight of it felt different, purposeful rather than desperate, decisive rather than pleading. I pressed the tip to the envelope's surface and wrote, "For David," in letters that looked clearer and more confident than my handwriting had appeared in months, each stroke a small declaration of independence from the man I'd been just 24 hours earlier. The envelope lay before me like a door I was about to close forever, and instead of the anxiety I'd expected to feel, there was only a strange sense of peace settling into my chest, like morning sunlight through winter windows. Instead of walking to the bedroom where my emergency fund had once lived, I opened the desk drawer and pulled out a receipt after making what might have been the most satisfying transaction of my entire life. The paper was still crisp, the ink fresh from my visit to the children's home downtown, where I'd donated every remaining dollar of the money I'd been setting aside for David's next inevitable request. The director, a kind woman named Sarah, had been surprised by the size of the donation from someone she'd never met. But I'd simply told her it was meant for children who understood the value of help, because they'd known what it meant to have nothing. Those kids didn't have parents to manipulate or guilt into funding their lifestyle choices. They had to earn everything through hard work and gratitude, qualities my own son had apparently never learned despite all my efforts to teach them. I smoothed the receipt flat against the desk and placed it carefully inside the envelope, then reached for a sheet of Martha's old stationery, the kind with tiny blue flowers along the border that she'd used for thank you notes and sympathy cards throughout our marriage. The blank page waited patiently as I considered my words, and when they came, they flowed with a clarity that felt like speaking in my own voice for the first time in years. "Son," I wrote, my pen moving steadily across the delicate paper, "this is the last money I will ever set aside for you. I have given it to children who understand what it means to stand on their own feet, who know the difference between a hand up and a handout, who would never dream of lying to the people who love them most." I paused, remembering Martha's voice from all those years ago when David had gotten in trouble for cheating on a test. Her gentle but firm words about the difference between enabling and loving. "When you have learned to do the same," I continued, "when you can look me in the eye and tell me honestly how you've been spending the money I've given you, then you are welcome to visit me as my son, rather than as someone seeking a loan." I signed it simply Dad and folded the note with deliberate care, slipping it in beside the receipt before sealing the envelope with the kind of attention I'd once reserved for important business correspondence. The finished product sat on the desk like a small bomb, innocent-looking but carrying enough explosive power to destroy the comfortable lies that had been poisoning our relationship for months. In my mind, I could hear Martha's voice as clearly as if she were sitting beside me. "Honey, loving your child also means teaching him, even when the lessons are hard ones." I nodded to the empty room, feeling for the first time like I was finally listening to wisdom. I'd been too afraid to hear while she was alive, too worried about being the bad parent, to recognize that sometimes being the bad parent was exactly what love required. The phone call to David was brief and businesslike, my voice steady as I asked him to stop by when he had time, mentioning that I had something important to give him. He sounded pleased, almost eager, in the way that had become achingly familiar over the past months. The tone of someone expecting another financial windfall, another envelope full of bills to fund whatever luxury had caught his attention this week. "I'll be right over, Dad," he said, and I could practically hear the smile in his voice, the anticipation that made my chest tight with a mixture of sadness and grim satisfaction. While waiting for him to arrive, I made coffee using the good china cups, the ones Martha had insisted we save for special occasions, because this felt like an occasion worth marking, even if it wasn't the kind of celebration I'd once imagined having with my son. David arrived 30 minutes later, and I watched through the window as he parked the expensive sedan I'd seen him driving outside the boutique, watched him check his reflection in the side mirror before walking to my front door with the casual confidence of someone who'd never doubted his welcome. He wore yet another shirt I didn't recognize, this one a soft gray that looked like it had cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. And his shoes were polished to mirror brightness, everything about his appearance broadcasting prosperity and success, built on foundations I now understood were entirely fictitious. "Hi, Dad," he said as I let him in, his voice warm and affectionate. And he gave me the kind of hug that had always melted my resistance in the past. But today, I felt the performance in it, the calculated charm of someone who'd learned exactly which buttons to push to get what he wanted. "I have something for you," I said, settling into my chair at the kitchen table and gesturing toward the envelope that waited there like a white flag of surrender. Or perhaps, I thought with dark satisfaction, like a declaration of war. David's eyes immediately locked onto the familiar rectangle, his face lighting up with the same expression I'd seen countless times before, eager and grateful and slightly embarrassed, but not enough to refuse whatever help was being offered. He reached for the envelope with practiced ease, his fingers working at the seal with the confidence of someone who'd never been disappointed by what he'd find inside. The smile remained fixed on his face as he unfolded the receipt, but I watched it slowly drain away like water from a broken cup as his eyes scanned the unfamiliar document, taking in the letterhead from the children's home, the amount that represented his expected windfall, the words that explained where his money had actually gone. "Dad," he said, his voice smaller now, uncertain, like a child who'd reached for a cookie jar only to find it empty. "What is this?" The receipt trembled in his hands as he looked up at me, confusion and the first hints of panic flickering across his features like shadows in firelight. He unfolded my note and read it twice, his lips moving silently as he processed words that clearly weren't what he'd expected to find, sentences that sounded nothing like the apologetic, eager to please father he'd grown accustomed to manipulating. The silence stretched between us like a chasm opening in the earth, and I could see him struggling to understand this new version of his parent, this man who would give away money to strangers rather than hand it over to his own flesh and blood. When he finally spoke again, his voice cracked like a teenager's going through puberty. "I don't understand. Why would you do this?" I leaned back in Martha's chair, feeling calmer than I had in months, my voice steady and clear as mountain water when I answered. Because for the first time in your adult life, I'm not going to give you money. I'm going to give you something more valuable, the opportunity to learn what it means to support yourself without lying to the people who love you. The words felt strange coming from my mouth, so different from the apologetic, accommodating tone I'd used with him for years. But they also felt right, in a way that surprised me with its intensity. David's face cycled through emotions I'd rarely seen him display in my presence. Confusion giving way to anger. Anger mixing with hurt. Hurt bleeding into something that looked uncomfortably like fear as he realized that his reliable source of funding had suddenly and inexplicably dried up. "But Dad, you don't understand," he began, falling back on the familiar script that had worked so many times before, his voice taking on that wheedling quality that had always made me feel guilty for even questioning his requests. "The business venture, the startup capital, the partnerships I told you about?" But I held up my hand to stop him, the gesture feeling more natural and authoritative than anything I'd done in years. "What I understand," I said, cutting through his practiced excuses with surgical precision, "is that I saw you and Jennifer shopping at Bellecourt Boutique yesterday, using the emergency credit card I gave you to buy luxury items while I shop for marked-down groceries to make ends meet. What I understand is that I overheard Jennifer telling you to ask me for more money to fund your trip to Japan, as if my pension exists solely to subsidize your vacations." The color drained from his face like someone had pulled a plug, and for the first time since he'd become an adult, I saw him looking at me not as a resource to be tapped, but as a person who might have feelings, might have limits, might have been paying far more attention than he'd realized. His mouth opened and closed several times without producing sound, and I watched his hands shake as he held the envelope containing the evidence of his lost income stream, torn between rage at being cut off and shame at being caught in his deception. "I can explain," he finally managed, but his voice lacked conviction, the hollow tone of someone who'd been backed into a corner and knew there was no way out except through the truth he'd been avoiding for months. "No," I said, standing up from the table with a steadiness that felt foreign but welcome. "You can't explain. And I don't want to hear you try. What you can do is leave my house and figure out how to support yourself and your wife without stealing from your elderly father. What you can do is learn the difference between a parent's love and a parent's bank account." When he left 20 minutes later, walking slowly to his expensive car like a man in shock, I stood and drew back the curtains I'd kept closed since Martha's death, letting sunlight flood the room for the first time in months. My reflection in the window glass showed a man who was still old, still thin, still marked by years of careful budgeting and modest living, but whose eyes held something new. Not the desperate hope I'd carried for so long, but a quiet satisfaction that felt more substantial than any gratitude David had ever expressed. I was smiling, I realized, a small, cold expression that felt like the first honest emotion I'd shown in years. The rules had changed, the game was different now, and this, I knew with absolute certainty, was only the beginning. The phone call to David 3 days later felt like the most dangerous thing I'd ever done. My heart hammering against my ribs as I dialed his number and waited for him to answer. When he picked up on the 4th ring, his voice sounded cautious, guarded in a way that told me he was still reeling from our last encounter, still trying to process the reality that his reliable funding source had evaporated overnight. "Dad?" he said, the single word carrying more uncertainty than I'd heard from him since childhood. And for a moment I almost felt sorry for him before remembering the credit card receipts, the overheard conversation, the months of systematic deception that had brought us to this point. I cleared my throat and put on my most conciliatory tone, the voice of a father who might be reconsidering his harsh stance, who might be ready to return to the old patterns that had worked so well for everyone except the man paying the bills. "David, I've been thinking," I said, letting a note of weariness creep into my voice, as if the past few days had been harder on me than on him. "Maybe I was too hasty the other day. Family should stick together, especially during difficult times." I could hear him straightening up on the other end of the line, could practically feel his relief and renewed hope radiating through the connection like heat from a furnace. "Why don't you and Jennifer come to dinner this weekend? Bring her parents too. I'd like to meet them properly, maybe clear the air between all of us." The invitation seemed to catch him off guard, and there was a long pause before he responded. But when he did, his voice carried the first genuine warmth I'd heard from him in months, the sound of someone who thought he'd been granted an unexpected reprieve from consequences he'd feared were permanent. Saturday evening arrived, and I spent the afternoon preparing what I intended to be the most memorable dinner party of my life. The menu was deliberately modest: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans from a can, nothing that would suggest extravagance or pretension. Everything designed to reinforce the image of a simple old man living on a fixed income who might need help from his successful family. I set the table with Martha's good china, the pieces we'd saved for special occasions, because this was certainly going to be special, though not in the way my guests expected. The centerpiece was a small arrangement of flowers from the grocery store, nothing fancy but cheerful enough to suggest a father who was making an effort to reconcile with his son, who was ready to acknowledge his mistakes and return to the old ways of doing business. They arrived fashionably late, which gave me time to observe them through the front window as they gathered themselves before approaching the house. Jennifer's parents stepped out of a luxury sedan that probably cost more than I'd made in my best year at the factory, both of them dressed like they were attending a country club function rather than dinner at a pensioner's modest home. Her mother wore a silk dress that caught the porch light like water, complemented by jewelry that glittered expensively in the evening air, while her father sported a cashmere coat that looked like it had never seen rain or snow or any of the indignities that weather visited upon ordinary clothing. David and Jennifer emerged from their own expensive car, the one I'd seen outside Bellecourt Boutique, with David carrying a bottle of wine that I could tell from the label was meant to impress rather than compliment the simple meal I'd prepared. The introductions were a masterpiece of social theater, with Jennifer's parents, Harold and Patricia Whitman, as they formally introduced themselves, playing their roles as gracious guests, slumming it with the unfortunate relations perfectly. Patricia's smile was bright and condescending as she complimented my charming little home, her eyes taking in the worn furniture and outdated decor with the kind of barely concealed pity that wealthy people reserve for those less fortunate than themselves. Harold pumped my hand with hearty enthusiasm while scanning the room like an appraiser estimating value, his expensive cologne mixing with Patricia's perfume to create a cloud of fragrance that seemed to overwhelm my modest kitchen with its aggressive luxury. David hovered nervously between his two families, clearly uncomfortable with the contrast, but determined to make this reconciliation work, while Jennifer glowed with the satisfaction of someone who felt vindicated by her parents' obvious superiority to her husband's embarrassing father. We settled around the dining room table, and I served the simple meal I'd prepared while listening to the conversation flow around me like water around a stone. Patricia was particularly effusive in her praise of David, raising her wine glass in a toast that made my stomach turn with its calculated cruelty. Harold and I feel so blessed to have a son-in-law who takes care of both families so generously. We never have to worry about anything, thanks to his success and his thoughtfulness. Harold nodded sagely, his voice carrying the weight of paternal authority as he added, It takes a special kind of man to support not just his own wife and children, but also his aging father and his in-laws. David truly is the pillar holding everyone up. I watched my son's face flush red as he forced a weak smile, his eyes darting between his wife's proud smirk and my carefully neutral expression, clearly torn between accepting credit he hadn't earned and fear of what I might say to contradict their version of reality. I said nothing during this performance, simply nodding politely and refilling wine glasses while my guests painted their picture of David as a successful provider whose generosity knew no bounds. Jennifer basked in her parents' praise like a cat in sunlight, adding her own commentary about how wonderful it was to have married someone so financially responsible, so caring toward his family, so different from the selfish young men she'd known before meeting him. The irony was so thick I could taste it, but I maintained my role as the grateful father being supported by his successful son, letting them build their narrative higher and higher until it would have that much farther to fall when I brought it crashing down around their ears. When the main course was finished and I could see them beginning to relax into the comfortable fiction they'd created, I excused myself and retrieved a manila folder from the kitchen counter, setting it down in the center of the table with the deliberate care of someone placing a bomb. The cheerful conversation faltered as all eyes focused on the unexpected addition to our dinner setting, and I could see confusion flickering across their faces as they tried to understand what new element had entered their carefully orchestrated evening. "These," I said, my voice steady and clear in the sudden silence, "represent the actual destination of every dollar I've saved over the past several years. Every penny that David has been claiming credit for providing to all of us." David's hand trembled as he opened the first envelope, and I watched the color drain from his face, like someone had opened a valve as he stared at the contents. Not cash or checks, but donation receipts paired with printed photographs from the local newspaper's website, showing me standing beside children at the community center, handing out warm winter coats to kids whose parents couldn't afford them. The caption under the largest photo was particularly clear. "Local father donates life savings to children's charity after discovering family exploitation." Below that were additional printouts I'd carefully prepared, including screenshots of social media posts showing David and Jennifer at luxury resorts, images of expensive purchases, records of credit card transactions that painted a very different picture of who was supporting whom in our extended family dynamic. The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the old wall clock ticking in the hallway, each second hammering down on their pride like a judge's gavel, delivering verdict after verdict of guilty as charged. Patricia's face went through a fascinating transformation, from confusion to comprehension, to the kind of mortification that comes with realizing you've been publicly humiliated by someone you'd dismissed as harmless, while Harold cleared his throat repeatedly and reached for his wine glass with the mechanical movements of a man whose world had just shifted on its axis. Jennifer kept her head down, staring at the table as if she could disappear into the wood grain, her cheeks burning red with shame that finally matched the color of the expensive dress she'd worn to impress her supposedly poor father-in-law. I leaned back in my chair, one hand resting on the final envelope I hadn't yet opened, and looked directly at David with the kind of steady gaze I should have been using on him for months. "Son," I said, my voice carrying across the silent room like a bell tolling. "For the first time in my adult life, I've put my money where it will actually do some good, where it will help people who understand the difference between charity and exploitation, who would never dream of lying to someone who loves them." David's lips moved soundlessly, his face cycling through emotions I'd never seen him display. Shame, fear, rage, and something that might have been recognition that his comfortable world of easy money and borrowed respectability had just collapsed around him like a house of cards in a hurricane. When they finally gathered themselves to leave 20 minutes later, shuffling toward the door like survivors of some natural disaster, I walked them out into the cool night air and watched them climb into their expensive cars with none of the confidence they'd displayed upon arrival. The wind carried away the heavy scent of their expensive perfumes, leaving behind only the clean smell of air and the satisfaction of a job well done. For the first time since Martha died, my small house felt truly clean, purged of the atmosphere of deception and manipulation that had been poisoning it for months. The air no longer carried the stench of my own humiliation, and as I watched their taillights disappear down the street, I realized that I was smiling, not the cold, calculating expression I'd worn during our confrontation, but something warmer and more genuine. The smile of a man who had finally learned the difference between being generous and being a fool. The phone rang at exactly 8:30 the next morning, cutting through the peaceful silence of my breakfast routine like a blade through silk. And I knew before picking it up that the evening's revelations had stirred something dark and dangerous in the Whitman family hive. The caller ID showed Harold's number, and I let it ring 3 more times while I finished buttering my toast, savoring these last moments of calm before the storm I'd unleashed came roaring back at me with all the fury of people who'd been publicly exposed for what they truly were. When I finally answered, my voice was steady and pleasant, the tone of a man who had nothing to hide and nothing to fear from whatever accusations might be hurled his way. "Good morning, Harold," I said, settling back into Martha's chair with my coffee cup in hand, prepared to enjoy whatever performance was about to unfold on the other end of the line. His voice, when it came, was carefully controlled but vibrating with barely suppressed rage, each word measured and precise in the way that only comes from someone who's spent considerable time rehearsing exactly what they plan to say. "What you did last night was completely inappropriate," he began, his tone suggesting that I was a wayward employee being called to account by a superior rather than a fellow adult who'd simply told the truth about his own money. "You humiliated our entire family in front of guests, spread private matters where they don't belong, and frankly, I'm not sure what you hoped to accomplish by airing dirty laundry that should have stayed between family members." The phrase, "dirty laundry," struck me as particularly rich, coming from someone whose family had been literally living off my laundry money for months. But I said nothing, letting his words flow over me like water off a duck's back, while I waited for him to reveal the real purpose of his call. "You've put this story in the newspapers, made our family look like freeloaders and con artists," Harold continued, his carefully maintained composure beginning to crack around the edges as his true feelings leaked through. "And for what? To make yourself look like some kind of saint? People will praise you for a while, sure, but eventually they'll start seeing David for what you've made him look like. A useless fool who can't even support his own father. He's your son, for Christ's sake. Doesn't that mean anything to you?" The irony of Harold lecturing me about the importance of family loyalty while his own family had been systematically draining my bank account was almost too perfect to be real, and I found myself smiling into the receiver as I listened to him dig his hole deeper with every word. The fact that he was more concerned about appearances than the underlying deception told me everything I needed to know about the kind of people I'd been dealing with all these months. I let the silence stretch out after he finished his tirade, counting slowly to 10, while Harold's breathing grew increasingly agitated on the other end of the line, before responding in the same calm, pleasant tone I'd used to greet him. "Harold, I'm curious about something," I said, setting down my coffee cup and leaning forward slightly, as if he could see me through the phone connection. In all of that passionate speech about family loyalty and keeping private matters private, I didn't hear you mention once whether any of what I revealed last night was actually untrue. Are you calling to dispute the facts I shared, or are you calling because you're embarrassed that those facts became public knowledge?" The question seemed to catch him off guard, and I heard him sputter for a moment before the line went dead with the sharp click of someone hanging up in frustration, leaving me alone with my breakfast and a deep sense of satisfaction at having struck home with my counterattack. But Harold's call was just the opening salvo in what I quickly realized was going to be a sustained campaign to pressure me back into my previous role as the family ATM. My phone buzzed with text messages throughout the morning, each one from Jennifer, and each one crafted with the kind of manipulation that would have worked perfectly on the old version of myself, the one who confused enabling with love and believed that keeping peace was more important than maintaining dignity. "Dad, I'm so hurt by what happened last night," read the first message, the words dripping with artificial sweetness that couldn't quite mask the underlying demand for capitulation. "I thought we had a better relationship than this. Everyone in town is talking about our family now, and not in a good way. People are staring at me in the grocery store, whispering behind my back at the coffee shop. Is this really what you wanted?" The messages continued throughout the day, each one escalating the emotional manipulation while maintaining the pretense of injured innocence, like water torture designed to wear down my resolve through sheer persistence rather than force. By evening, I found myself curious about how my actions were playing out in the broader community that had been watching David's supposed success story unfold over the past months, so I opened the social media accounts I rarely used and navigated to his profile with the kind of morbid fascination that draws people to traffic accidents. The luxury vacation photos were still there, of course. David and Jennifer raising champagne glasses on tropical beaches, posing beside infinity pools, dining at restaurants where the wine probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. But the comments section had transformed overnight from admiring congratulations to something much more interesting and pointed. "Startup money, huh?" wrote someone I didn't recognize. "Looks more like Daddy's pension fund to me." Another comment, from a name I vaguely remembered as belonging to one of David's former co-workers, was even more direct. "Where's the successful entrepreneur I keep hearing about? All I see in these photos is an old man being taken advantage of by people who should know better." The contrast between David's forced smile in the vacation photos and the increasingly hostile comment thread created a cognitive dissonance that was almost artistic in its perfect irony, and I found myself studying his face in image after image, noting the tension around his eyes that I'd missed during my months of willful blindness, the way his posture suggested someone performing happiness rather than genuinely experiencing it. Even surrounded by luxury and beautiful scenery, he looked like a man who knew he was living a lie, who understood on some level that his comfortable life was built on foundations that could crumble at any moment if the people funding it decided to stop playing along with his charade. The knowledge that I had been that foundation, that my pension checks and emergency credit cards had paid for every sunset dinner and designer outfit, filled me with a mixture of sadness and grim satisfaction that was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. As I scrolled through more comments, each one more critical than the last, I realized that Harold had been at least partially correct about one thing. The story of David's deception was spreading beyond our immediate family circle, becoming the kind of local gossip that would follow him for years to come. But rather than feeling guilty about exposing him to public scrutiny, I felt a cold certainty settling in my chest, like winter air. The understanding that this was exactly what needed to happen to people who built their lives on lies and exploitation. The Whitmans and their daughter had spent months treating me like a convenient funding source. someone whose feelings and financial security mattered less than their comfort and social status. And now they were discovering that actions have consequences, that stealing from elderly parents isn't a victimless crime just because the victim loves you enough to suffer in silence. But even as I savored this moment of vindication, I could see the shape of what was coming next with the clarity that comes from finally understanding the true nature of the people I'd been dealing with all along. Harold's angry phone call, Jennifer's manipulative text messages, the growing social media scrutiny, none of it would make them reflect on their behavior or feel genuine remorse for what they'd done to me. Instead, it would make them more desperate, more creative in their efforts to restore the comfortable dynamic where my money flowed freely into their accounts while they took credit for providing for the family. They wouldn't stop because being humiliated had taught them a lesson about respect or gratitude. They would escalate because being humiliated had made them angry, and angry people who've built their lifestyle on someone else's generosity don't just fade away quietly when the money stops coming. Looking at my reflection in the darkened window, I realized that the war I'd started with last night's dinner party was far from over. If anything, I'd simply given my opponents reason to bring out heavier weapons in their campaign to turn me back into the compliant old man who'd funded their dreams while living on scraps from his own table. The bank statement arrived on a Tuesday morning like it always did. But this time, I opened it with different eyes than the ones that had been scanning these documents for the past 3 years, without truly seeing what they contained. There, among the familiar list of pension deposits and utility withdrawals, was the line item that had been bleeding my account dry every month since David's wedding. Maple Ridge Apartment Complex, mortgage payment $1,847. The number seemed to pulse on the page as I stared at it, finally understanding the full scope of how thoroughly I'd been financing not just David's lifestyle, but his very shelter, the foundation upon which he'd built his entire adult identity as a successful young man who could provide for his family. I'd co-signed for that apartment when they got married, telling myself that helping them secure a nice place to live was what good fathers did. But now I saw it for what it truly was. Another link in the chain that bound me to their deception. Another way for them to live beyond their means while I footed the bill. The memory of signing those loan documents came flooding back with painful clarity. How proud I'd felt to be able to help them get approved for a place that was clearly beyond what David could afford on his own income. How Patricia Whitman had commented approvingly on the lovely neighborhood and the excellent investment potential without ever mentioning who would actually be making that investment possible. I'd justified the monthly payments to myself as temporary assistance, something I'd do for a year or two until David's career took off and he could refinance in his own name. But temporary had somehow stretched into 3 years of automatic withdrawals that I'd stopped noticing because acknowledging them would have forced me to confront how completely I'd been subsidizing their entire existence. The apartment had become the stage where they performed their prosperity for friends and family, the backdrop for all those social media photos that made David look like a successful provider, and I'd been paying for every square foot of that illusion. I set the statement down and walked to the phone with the kind of deliberate calm that comes from finally seeing the last piece of a puzzle click into place, understanding not just what needed to be done, but why it had to be done exactly this way. The number for First National Bank was printed at the top of every statement, and I dialed it slowly, giving myself time to rehearse the words I was about to speak, the simple request that would bring David's house of cards tumbling down more completely than any dinner party confrontation ever could. The customer service representative who answered sounded young and professional, her voice carrying the practiced cheerfulness of someone who dealt with routine banking inquiries all day long. And I felt almost sorry for her, as I prepared to make her part of something that would destroy lives with a few keystrokes. "I need to stop the automatic payments from my checking account," I said, when she asked how she could help me today. My voice steady and businesslike, as if I were canceling a newspaper subscription rather than pulling the financial foundation out from under my son's entire adult life. There was a pause while she pulled up my account information, and I could hear computer keys clicking as she navigated through screens that contained years of my financial history, all the evidence of how completely I'd been supporting people who saw me as nothing more than a convenient funding source. "I see the automatic mortgage payments to Maple Ridge apartment complex," she said finally, her tone shifting slightly as she realized this wasn't a routine transaction. "Are you sure you want to discontinue these payments? If you're the co-signer, stopping payments could affect your credit rating, and the primary borrower would become solely responsible for the full amount." "I understand completely," I replied, surprised by how calm I felt as I spoke the words that would change everything. How peaceful it was to finally stop being the silent partner in my own exploitation. "As of today, I want all automatic payments to that account stopped. The primary borrower can handle his own obligations from now on." The representative tried to transfer me to a retention specialist, someone trained to talk customers out of decisions that might cost the bank money, but I declined politely and firmly, explaining that my mind was made up and no amount of discussion would change it. When she asked if I wanted to notify the primary borrower of this change, I paused for just a moment before answering, "No, he'll find out when he needs to." And then I hung up the phone and sat back in Martha's chair, feeling like I'd just cut the last rope tying me to a sinking ship. The weeks that followed passed with an eerie quiet that felt like the calm before a storm, and I found myself checking the mail each day with a mixture of anticipation and dread, waiting for some sign that David had discovered his financial lifeline had been severed. But there were no panicked phone calls, no desperate text messages, no surprise visits from him or his wife demanding explanations for why their mortgage payment had suddenly bounced. Either they hadn't noticed yet, which seemed impossible given how carefully people track their housing costs, or they were scrambling behind the scenes to come up with the money from other sources, perhaps finally forced to confront the reality of their actual financial situation versus the lifestyle they'd been projecting to the world. I continued my daily routines, grocery shopping with coupons, reading library books instead of buying new ones, walking for exercise because gym memberships were an unaffordable luxury. But now these habits felt like choices rather than deprivations, evidence of a simpler way of living that didn't depend on deception or exploitation. 2 months after I'd made that phone call, I found myself driving past the Maple Ridge complex on my way back from a doctor's appointment, and what I saw there stopped me so completely that I had to pull over and park across the street just to process what was happening. A large moving truck sat in the parking lot outside David's building, its back doors open wide like the mouth of some enormous creature preparing to swallow the contents of the life I'd been subsidizing for 3 years. Workers in uniform shirts moved with practiced efficiency, carrying box after box down the stairs and loading them into the truck's cavernous interior. And I recognized some of the items even from this distance. The white leather sofa that had cost more than my monthly pension check. The glass bar cart with its collection of expensive liquor bottles. The oversized suitcases that had accompanied David and Jennifer on all their luxury vacations. Neighbors had gathered in small clusters on the sidewalk, drawn by the spectacle of what was clearly an involuntary move, and their voices carried across the parking lot with the kind of gossipy excitement that always accompanies other people's misfortune. "They always acted like they owned the place," I heard one woman say to her companion, "showing off with that fancy car and those expensive clothes, but I guess it was all on credit." Another voice added, "Didn't she just post photos from some resort in the Caribbean? Must be nice to vacation when you can't even pay your mortgage." The commentary was cruel but accurate, and I found myself nodding along with observations that perfectly captured the disconnect between David's projected image and his actual financial reality. From my position across the street, I could see David himself near the building entrance, his head hanging low and his shirt soaked with sweat, looking like a man who'd aged years in the span of weeks. Jennifer stood near the truck, arguing with someone in a business suit who held a clipboard and what looked like legal documents, her voice raised to the kind of volume that suggested panic poorly disguised as indignation. "You can't do this," she was saying, her words carrying clearly across the parking lot. "This is our home. We have rights." The man with the clipboard remained professionally calm as he responded. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but the loan has been in default for 2 months. This property serves as collateral for the debt, and ownership has reverted to the lending institution." Harold and Patricia Whitman stood slightly apart from the main action, looking like refugees from their own social class as they watched their daughter's carefully constructed world collapse around them. Patricia clutched Jennifer's arm with white knuckles, her eyes wet with tears that might have been genuine grief or simply embarrassment at being associated with such a public spectacle, while Harold stood silent with his lips pressed into a thin line, his usual booming confidence replaced by the deflated posture of a man whose son-in-law's success story had just been revealed as complete fiction. The contrast between this scene and the elegant dinner party they'd hosted just months ago was so stark, it felt like watching a play where all the actors had suddenly switched roles, transforming from wealthy benefactors into desperate refugees in the space between acts. I sat in my car and watched them load the last of their possessions. People who had once raised champagne glasses in that gleaming apartment, who had performed prosperity with such conviction that I'd almost believed in it myself, now reduced to sitting on folding chairs beside cardboard boxes while strangers disposed of the remnants of their artificial life. The whole neighborhood had turned out to witness their fall, drawn by the same morbid fascination that makes people slow down to look at traffic accidents, and I could see David's face burning with shame as he realized how completely his deception had been exposed, not just to his family, but to everyone who'd ever envied his apparent success. When the last box had been loaded and the truck pulled away, carrying with it all the physical evidence of the lie I'd been funding, I started my engine and drove slowly past the small group still gathered on the sidewalk, close enough to see the defeat in David's eyes, but far enough away that none of them recognized the old man in the modest sedan who had just brought their castle of sand crashing down around them. Have you ever had to make a decision that you knew would hurt someone you love, but that you also knew was necessary for your own survival? How did it feel to watch the consequences play out? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe.